Have you ever been humiliated by someone who was supposed to love you in front of everyone who mattered? That happened to me at my own wedding. My mother-in-law looked me straight in the eye, then treated me like hired help in front of 30 guests, pretending she didn't recognize her own son's bride. What she didn't know was standing quietly in the back of the room, waiting for the exact right moment to speak. My name is Claire, and for most of my life I was very good at being underestimated. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental above a laundromat in Scranton, raised by a mother who worked double shifts as a hospital administrator and never once complained where I could hear her. My father left before I could remember his face. What I remember instead is my mother, Margaret, coming home at 11 at night smelling like hand sanitizer, sitting at our kitchen table and going over my homework like it was the most important document in the world. She used to say, "Claire, people will look at where you started and decide where you'll end up. Don't ever let them be right." I didn't understand what she meant until years later. By then, she was gone. A heart condition none of us knew about, taken from me 2 weeks after I turned 26. What she left behind wasn't much by most standards: a modest life insurance payout, a storage unit of photographs, and a name, Hartwell, that meant nothing to anyone I knew. Or so I thought. I met Daniel Whitfield 18 months later at a fundraising gala I was covering for the nonprofit I worked at. I wasn't supposed to be at the tables that night. I was supposed to be checking in donors at the door, but a seating mix-up put me next to a man in a slightly wrinkled tuxedo who spent the entire dinner asking me questions instead of talking about himself. That was rare in that room. Most people there talked about themselves for a living. Daniel was kind in a way that felt unpracticed, which I would later learn was unusual for someone raised the way he was. His family had money, not new money, not flashy money, the kind of old, quiet money that owns things instead of showing them off. Whitfield Textiles had been in his family for 3 generations, a manufacturing company that once employed half a small Pennsylvania town, and still carried the weight of that legacy, even as the industry shifted beneath it. I didn't know any of that the night we met. I just knew he laughed at the right things and listened like he meant it. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. In that time, I met his father, Richard, exactly 4 times. Always briefly, always politely. Richard was a tired man who seemed to be perpetually solving a problem just out of frame. He was courteous to me in the detached way you're courteous to a waiter. His mother, Eleanor, I met considerably more. Eleanor Whitfield had a way of looking at a person that made you feel like you'd tracked mud onto a white carpet just by existing. The first time Daniel brought me to their house for dinner, she asked me 3 questions in a row. Where did you go to school? What do your parents do? Where is your family from? And by the 3rd answer, her smile had gone thin and polite in a way that told me everything I needed to know. I had failed some test I didn't know I was taking. "She'll come around," Daniel told me afterward, more than once, over 2 years, like a man repeating a prayer he wasn't sure was working. She did not come around. She referred to me, when she thought I couldn't hear, as Daniel's little project. She once suggested at a family lunch that I might feel more comfortable eating in the kitchen with the caterers rather than the dining room because, and I quote, "some people find all this formality overwhelming if they're not used to it." She corrected my fork usage in front of Daniel's cousins. She asked with genuine confusion whether I had a backup plan in case things with Daniel didn't work out, as though our relationship were a temp job. I bore all of it because I loved Daniel and because my mother had taught me that grace under pressure was its own kind of power. I told myself Eleanor's opinion of me didn't determine my worth. I told myself a lot of things. What I did not tell anyone, not even Daniel, not fully, was the truth about my mother's family. Margaret Hartwell had, in her youth, been estranged from her own father, a private and famously reclusive investor named Walter Hartwell, over a disagreement so old and so painful that she never spoke of the details, only the outcome. She left, took nothing, and built her life from zero, on purpose, to prove she didn't need what he had. I only learned the extent of what he had meant after she died, when a lawyer named Arthur Preston called me 2 weeks after the funeral and asked me to come to his office. I want to be clear that this isn't a story about a secret fortune falling into my lap and solving all my problems, because that's not what happened, and that's not the kind of person my mother raised me to be. What I learned sitting in Arthur Preston's office that day was that my mother had quietly reconciled with her father in her final years, a reconciliation she never told me about, maybe because she wasn't ready, maybe because she wanted to handle it fully before bringing me in. Walter Hartwell had passed 8 months before her. In his will, control of the Hartwell Family Trust, a modest but real holding company built on decades of careful, unglamorous investing, passed to my mother. When she died so suddenly after, it passed to me. I was, at 26 years old, the sole trustee of a trust worth more than I could process at the time, with one significant, deliberate stipulation written into it by my grandfather himself, a man I'd never met. The trust's assets were not to be touched, spent, or revealed for personal enrichment or status. It existed to be managed, not flaunted. Arthur Preston told me my grandfather's exact words, which he'd apparently repeated often near the end of his life. Let her build her own name first. This is just insurance, not identity. So I did. I kept working my nonprofit job. I kept living in my one-bedroom apartment. I let Arthur Preston and his firm manage the trust quietly in the background, the way it always had been managed, and I told almost no one it existed. Not my closest friends, not for a long time Daniel. I know how that sounds now, but I want you to understand. I wasn't hiding a fortune to manipulate anyone. I was protecting the one thing my mother's family history had taught me could be twisted into something ugly. Money. When it enters a relationship too early, changes how people see you. And I desperately wanted Daniel to love me for exactly who I was without it. By the time I realized how deep Eleanor's contempt for me really ran, revealing it felt less like honesty and more like currency I refused to spend just to win her approval. I told Daniel about the trust 3 months before our wedding, mostly out of practicality. A will needed updating, some paperwork required his signature as my spouse-to-be. His reaction was, in classic Daniel fashion, almost comically understated. He read through the summary Arthur prepared, went quiet for a long moment, and then said, "So the reason you split the check on our third date was principle, not necessity." "Both," I said. He laughed, and then he got serious, and he asked me the only question that mattered to him. "Does this change anything about us?" It didn't. We agreed, genuinely agreed, not performed agreement, that the trust would stay exactly where it had always been, quiet, managed, separate from our daily life. I asked him not to tell his parents, not because I was ashamed of it, but because some instinct in me knew, with total certainty, that if Eleanor Whitfield learned I came from real money, she wouldn't respect me any more than she already didn't. She'd simply recalibrate her contempt into something else. Suspicion, maybe. Or a new and more sophisticated form of condescension. I wasn't interested in either. Daniel agreed. He kept our secret. I don't think either of us fully understood at the time how much that secret would end up mattering. The wedding was set for the last Saturday in September at Ashford Hall, a restored estate about 40 minutes outside the city that had been in the Whitfield family's social orbit for decades. Not owned by them, but the kind of venue where the Whitfields and their circle held everything from charity galas to milestone anniversaries. Eleanor had strong opinions about every detail of the day, most of which she communicated directly to the wedding planner rather than to me, as though I were an interested bystander rather than the bride. I let most of it go. I picked my battles. I wanted, more than anything, for the day to be about Daniel and me, not about winning a war of attrition with his mother over napkin colors. What I did not anticipate, what I don't think anyone could have fully anticipated, was what Eleanor would do during cocktail hour. The ceremony itself went beautifully. Daniel cried when I walked down the aisle, which surprised both of us. My mother wasn't there to see it, but my Aunt Diane, her only sister, walked me down in her place, and I felt Margaret Hartwell's presence in that moment more strongly than I had in years. Cocktail hour was held on the east lawn, string lights strung between the old oak trees, the kind of golden September evening that looks staged even when it isn't. I was making my way across the lawn to find Daniel when I heard my mother-in-law's voice cut through the ambient chatter, sharp and carrying, the way certain voices are trained to carry in rooms where they expect to be obeyed. "Excuse me, you in the white." "Yes, you." I turned along with a dozen other guests to see Eleanor pointing directly at me. I was standing near the raw bar in my wedding dress, a glass of champagne in my hand, and for one disorienting second, I genuinely thought she was addressing someone behind me. She wasn't. "The centerpieces on table 6 are crooked, and I asked for the water glasses refreshed 20 minutes ago," Eleanor said, loud enough for the surrounding cluster of guests to go quiet. "I understand it's a big event, but this is simply not the level of service we discussed with the venue coordinator." I stood there, champagne in hand, wedding dress catching the last of the evening light, and understood with total clarity that my mother-in-law had just addressed me in front of roughly 30 guests as if I were catering staff. I want to say I handled it with perfect, cool composure. The truth is, for about 3 full seconds, I couldn't speak at all. "Eleanor," I finally said, "I'm not—" "Oh, for heaven's sake, just find someone who can address the tables then, if it's not your department," she said, already turning away, waving a dismissive hand, as though the conversation and I were an inconvenience she'd already mentally filed and moved past. Some of these agencies really don't train their staff on names. The guests near me had gone very quiet. I saw a woman I didn't recognize, a Whitfield family friend I'd learned later, actually put a hand over her mouth. I saw my Aunt Diane 20 feet away go rigid with fury. And I saw, walking up behind his mother at exactly the wrong moment to have missed the whole thing, Daniel, whose face went through about 4 different emotions in the space of 2 seconds before landing on something I'd never seen on him before. Quiet, controlled anger. "Mom," he said, "that's Claire. That's my wife." Eleanor turned back, and to her credit, or perhaps to the detriment of the story because it would have been almost easier if she'd simply been confused, she did not look embarrassed. She looked, for just a flicker of a second, almost amused, before smoothing her expression into something more socially acceptable. "Well, in that dress, from behind, in this light, anyone could make that mistake," she said, with a small laugh as though inviting the surrounding guests to share the joke. A few offered strained, uncomfortable smiles. Most didn't. I could have made a scene right there. Some version of me, a version raised with a shorter fuse, might have. But I thought of my mother, of double shifts and hand sanitizer, and a woman who never once let anyone see her rattled even when she had every right to be. And I found something steadier in myself. "It's all right," I said, to no one in particular, and mostly to end it. "Let's just enjoy evening." Daniel did not think it was all right. I watched him have a low, tense conversation with his mother near the bar for several minutes, his jaw set in a way I recognized from the handful of times I'd seen him truly angry. Eleanor's expression cycled between defensive and dismissive. Whatever he said to her, it did not visibly land. I thought that was the worst of it. I wrong. Dinner came, and with it the toasts. Daniel's best man spoke, funny and warm, about their college years. My Aunt Diane spoke about my mother, about the woman who wasn't there, and there wasn't a dry eye at our table, mine included. Then Eleanor stood up. I remember thinking, even as she rose, glass in hand, that I should have expected this, that a woman who could mistake me for catering staff at my own wedding was unlikely to deliver a toast without at least one more knife tucked into the velvet. She started well enough. She talked about Daniel as a boy, about watching him grow into a thoughtful man, about her hopes for his future. And then, smiling out at the room, she said the words I still hear sometimes, late at night, when I let myself think about that day too long. "Daniel has always had a generous heart," she said, "sometimes generous to a fault. He's always been drawn to people who need rescuing in one way or another. I suppose that's admirable in its own way. It takes a certain kind of open-mindedness to build a life with someone who comes from so little. And I hope, in time, Claire grows into everything this family and this life will ask of her. The room did that particular kind of silence that isn't really silence at all. 100 small intakes of breath, the clink of a fork set down too carefully, someone's chair creaking as they shifted in discomfort. My face went hot. Beside me, I felt Daniel go rigid. I looked at Richard, Daniel's father, sitting a few seats down. He had his eyes closed, one hand pressed briefly to his forehead. The universal posture of a man who has spent 30 years absorbing his wife's public missteps. I don't fully know what I would have done next. I've thought about it many times since. Whether I would have stood up myself, whether I would have simply smiled through it the way I'd smiled through 2 years of smaller cruelties. I never got the chance to find out, because at that exact moment, a man I recognized but hadn't expected to see there rose from a table near the back of the room. Arthur Preston, my family's lawyer, my grandfather's lawyer once, and now the trustees' counsel. My counsel, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the unhurried, deliberate bearing of someone who has spent his career choosing his moments very, very carefully. I hadn't invited him as a guest exactly. He'd been on the list at my request, quietly, as a nod to my mother, someone who'd known her, who represented the last living link to the Hartwell side of my family. I never imagined he'd speak. I certainly never imagined why he would choose to, right then. "Forgive the interruption," Arthur said, and his voice, trained over decades of boardrooms and courtrooms, carried through the room with an authority that made even Eleanor pause, glass still raised. I don't often speak at social occasions, but I find myself compelled to correct the record, briefly, out of respect for a woman who isn't here tonight to do it herself. He looked at me, not unkindly, almost like he was asking permission. I don't know what my face did, but he continued. Claire's mother, Margaret Hartwell, was the daughter of Walter Hartwell, founder of the Hartwell Family Trust. Some of you in the finance and manufacturing sectors may recognize the name. Margaret built her own life deliberately separate from that inheritance, a choice I respected a great deal, and Claire has honored that same principle since the trust passed to her 18 months ago. She has not touched a cent of it for her own comfort. She still works the same nonprofit job she held when I met her. I only raise this now because I think Margaret, and frankly Walter, would have wanted the record corrected before a room full of people who just heard her described as coming from so little. You could have heard a pin drop on the lawn outside. I'll add, Arthur continued, and here his tone shifted, became more precise, more clearly a matter of professional obligation than personal defense, that some of you may not be aware the Hartwell Trust extended a significant financing arrangement to Whitfield Textiles 14 months ago, structured through a private holding vehicle to help stabilize the company during a difficult restructuring period. That arrangement included standard reputational covenants, as is common in agreements of that size. I raise this only because, as trustees' counsel, it is now, unfortunately, part of my professional duty to note this evening for the record. I watched the color drain out of Richard Whitfield's face in real time. I watched him turn, slowly, to look at his wife. And I understood in that instant, with the sick, sinking clarity of pieces falling into place, that Richard had known exactly whose money had kept his family's company afloat during the restructuring. He'd simply never known it belonged, quite literally, to his own daughter-in-law. Eleanor's champagne glass was still raised, forgotten, halfway to a toast that would now never finish the way she intended. I need to be honest about something here, because this isn't a story about me orchestrating a public humiliation as revenge. I hadn't asked Arthur to say any of that. I found out only that night, standing on the lawn afterward with Daniel, stunned, that the Hartwell Trust's financing arrangement with Whitfield Textiles had gone through Arthur's firm entirely on the corporate side, routine business, structured long before Daniel and I were even engaged, one of dozens of holdings the trust quietly managed. I hadn't known Whitfield Textiles was one of them. Arthur, it turned out, hadn't fully clocked the connection himself until he sat down at that dinner and heard the family's surname repeated all evening, put it together, and made a judgment call, in the moment, about a woman he'd known since she was a little girl trailing after her mother in his office. I wasn't going to sit there and let her talk about Margaret's daughter like that, he told me later simply. Some things you correct on the spot, or you don't get another chance. The rest of the evening did not proceed as planned. Richard pulled Eleanor aside almost immediately, and whatever was said between them, Eleanor emerged from it visibly shaken in a way I had genuinely never seen. Not defensive, not performing offense, just quiet. She did not finish her toast. She sat down. Daniel, for his part, didn't hesitate for even a second. He stood, took my hand in front of the entire room and said simply, "I'd like to finish the toast my mother started, if that's all right." He talked about me. Really, about me. The me who'd shown up to our third date with a spreadsheet of split expenses. The me who worked 60-hour weeks at a nonprofit that couldn't pay her what she was worth because she believed in the mission. The me who had never once, in 2 years, mentioned a single dollar of a fortune she could have used to impress anyone. "I married the most quietly principled person I've ever met," he said. "I hope one day my family understands how lucky we are to have her." I cried. Not delicately. My Aunt Diane cried harder. Eleanor found me the next morning, before Daniel and I left for our honeymoon, in the hotel lobby alone, without an audience for the first time since I'd known her. She didn't apologize in the way I might have scripted if I'd been writing this story myself. She was too proud, and honestly, some habits that old don't unlearn themselves in 12 hours. But she said something I've held on to since. "I misjudged you. I'm not in the habit of admitting that, so I hope you understand what it cost me to say it." And then, quieter, "Your mother would be proud of the woman you became without any of it." It wasn't everything. But it was something, and it was more than I expected, and over the 2 years since, it has slowly, imperfectly, become the foundation of something like respect between us. Not warmth, not yet, maybe not ever fully, but respect, which I've learned to value more than false warmth anyway. Richard, for his part, called me 2 weeks after the wedding to formally thank me. Not for the financing, which had been a business decision made long before I was in the picture, but for not using that dinner or any dinner since to hold it over his family. "You could have let her keep humiliating herself," he said. "You didn't." I think about my mother a lot when I think about that night, about a woman who left a fortune behind on principle and built something real from nothing, who never got to see her daughter walk down an aisle, who never met the man I married, who would have found the entire spectacle of that toast, the crooked centerpieces, the mistaken identity, the lawyer standing up like something out of a courtroom drama, almost darkly funny in the way she found most human vanity funny. People ask me sometimes if I regret keeping the trust quiet for so long, if things would have been easier if I'd simply told Eleanor who I was from the start. I don't think so. I think if I'd led with money, she would have respected the money, not me. And I would never have known the difference. Instead, I got to watch a room full of people, and eventually even her, see exactly who I was without it, and decide for themselves what that was worth. My mother used to say people will look at where you started and decide where you'll end up. Don't ever let them be right. They didn't get to be right about me. And in the end, neither did Eleanor.